When an avoidant ex begins to circle back into your life, the first thing they're really looking for isn't romance or validation or even closure. It's safety. They're not testing how much you still love them. They're testing whether they can come closer to you without losing themselves in the process. And that distinction is everything. Because for someone with an avoidant attachment pattern, intimacy has always carried a cost, the cost of autonomy. To them, closeness feels like a trap that slowly erases their sense of individuality. So before they risk it again, they'll subconsciously set up little emotional tests. Not out of manipulation, but out of self-protection. You'll notice it in the silence, the slower replies, the moments when they seem to lean in and then pull back without explanation. Most people take those mixed signals as a rejection. They panic, overanalyze, or start chasing, trying to prove they're safe to love. But that reaction actually reinforces the avoidant's deepest fear, that closeness will equal control, that love will turn into pressure. When you chase, they see enmeshment. When you demand clarity, they feel cornered. And that's when the wall goes back up. What they're really watching is how you regulate yourself in uncertainty. Can you stay grounded when they withdraw a little? Can you hold emotional space without needing immediate reassurance? That's the test. Because to an avoidant, safety doesn't look like passion. It looks like peace. It looks like someone who doesn't panic when connection becomes inconsistent. It's someone who can say, I care about you, but I'm not going to lose my balance trying to pull you closer. That calm energy disarms them. It tells them you're not a threat to their independence, and paradoxically, that's what allows them to come closer. It's hard, though, because every anxious impulse in you will want to reach out, fix things, or fill the silence. But that silence is where your growth happens. It's where you learn to self-soothe instead of seek constant reassurance. You begin to understand that love without control is stronger than love that demands constant proof. You start to realize that your ability to stay composed, to maintain emotional steadiness, is what actually builds trust with someone who fears it most. There's a subtle but powerful shift that happens when you stop trying to prove your worth and start embodying your value. You go from performing to connecting, from chasing safety to creating it. Because emotional safety isn't built by convincing someone you won't hurt them. It's built by showing that you can stay grounded even when the connection feels uncertain. And that groundedness tells the avoidant part of them. You can be close without disappearing. That's when their nervous system starts to relax. That's when they stop seeing love as a risk and start feeling it as a refuge. So how do you pass this test? You don't. You live through it. You notice when your anxiety spikes, and instead of reacting, you breathe. You let silence exist without rushing to fill it. You allow their distance without interpreting it as rejection. You stay kind but contained. Emotionally open but not emotionally exposed. That balance is power. It's the kind of quiet confidence that says, I'm here, but I'm whole with or without you. And that energy is magnetic. It communicates safety not just for them, but for you too. Because here's the truth, avoidants aren't drawn to people who chase, that they're drawn to people who can stand still without losing warmth. They need to feel your steadiness before they can trust their own emotions around you. And when you master that, when you can be present without pressure, calm without detachment, you change the dynamic entirely. You stop replaying the same anxious, avoidant cycle, and you begin modeling something healthier, emotional sovereignty. That's what emotional safety really is. Sovereignty. It's the knowing that love should expand you, not erase you. That closeness should coexist with freedom. That two people can stay connected without one person disappearing into the other. And when you embody that truth, you're no longer just waiting to see if the avoidant will come back. You're becoming the kind of person they can safely come back to. So if you find yourself in that limbo, wondering why they're being distant again or testing your patience, remember, this isn't a game. It's a nervous system trying to protect itself. Your job isn't to pass their test by performing calmness. It's to genuinely become calm, to regulate yourself so deeply that their pullbacks no longer destabilize you. That's how you shift from reactive to responsive, from desperate to dignified. And when you can hold that space, steady, patient, self-contained, something profound happens. They start to realize that intimacy doesn't have to feel like entrapment. That closeness can feel like choice. And that safety, the one thing they've been testing for all along, is something you already embody. The real test, in the end, isn't whether they come back. It's whether you can stay grounded enough to meet love without losing yourself again. The second test an avoidant ex will give you is all about consistency, not the kind that's measured by words or effort, but by energy. They want to know, are you who you say you are when the emotional reward disappears? Because for someone with avoidant attachment, inconsistency is a kind of emotional trauma. They've learned, often early on, that love can shift without warning, warm one moment, cold the next. And when that happens, their nervous system wires itself to expect disappointment. So when they start to re-engage, they're subconsciously scanning for one thing: stability. They want to know whether your calm is real or whether it's conditional on how much attention they give you. You'll notice this test when the communication starts to feel uneven. One day, they're fully present, texting, opening up, reminiscing. The next day, they're quiet, distracted, or distant. And it's easy to think they're playing games. But in reality, they're gathering data. They're not testing your love. They're testing your emotional regulation. They're observing how you respond when they stop feeding you the validation you've grown used to. Do you become cold? Do you start mirroring their distance? Or do you maintain your tone? Warm, grounded, and self-contained, regardless of what they're doing. Because here's the truth: avoidants crave emotional safety, but they trust emotional consistency. To them, inconsistency equals danger. If they sense that your affection is dependent on their behavior, that you're loving when they're engaged and withdrawn when they're not, they'll retreat. It confirms their fear that closeness will eventually become conditional. But if you remain emotionally steady, if you can communicate with kindness, even when they pull back, they begin to relax. You stop being a potential threat and you start representing something new, something unfamiliar but deeply attractive: stability without control. Consistency is more than just not overreacting. It's emotional integrity in motion. It's the ability to stay aligned with your values, even when you're not being rewarded for it. When an avoidant pulls away and you still respond with grace, not to please them, but because that's who you are, you signal something powerful. I am emotionally predictable, not performative. You become safe to attach to because you no longer operate in the same push-pull rhythm that triggered them in the first place. This is where self-awareness matters. You can't fake calm energy. You can't pretend to be non-reactive while secretly obsessing over their every move. They can feel the tension. Authentic consistency comes from emotional maturity, from learning to self-regulate your nervous system instead of outsourcing that regulation to another person's attention. It's not about suppressing your feelings. It's about anchoring them. You can be disappointed and still respond with composure. You can feel uncertain and still act with intention. That's what emotional stability looks like in real time. When you embody that steadiness, the dynamic changes. The avoidant stops bracing for emotional turbulence and starts testing less. Because what they really fear isn't love, it's volatility, the unpredictable cycle of connection followed by emotional chaos. The moments when affection turns into resentment or patience turns into punishment. If you can be the one who breaks that pattern, who stays calm when things slow down, who keeps showing up in your truth without overextending, you start teaching their nervous system that intimacy can coexist with peace. This doesn't mean tolerating emotional neglect or chasing breadcrumbs. It means practicing emotional neutrality, responding from clarity, not craving. It's okay to pull back if they go silent, but do it without hostility. It's okay to express your needs, but do it without blame. That blend of strength and gentleness is magnetic to an avoidant, because it shows that your boundaries aren't reactions, they're principles. Think of it like this: the more consistent you become, the more predictable your emotional rhythm feels to them. And that predictability becomes the foundation of safety. They no longer have to guard themselves against sudden changes or hidden expectations. They can start to trust that what they see is what they'll continue to get. And in relationships, especially with avoidance, that predictability is everything. It's the bridge between curiosity and commitment. So when you find yourself wondering why they've gone quiet again, pause before reacting. Ask yourself, can I stay the same person I was when they were showing up? That question alone can shift your mindset, because love that depends on ideal conditions isn't love, it's performance. Real connection comes from being emotionally grounded, even when things get uncomfortable. And that's what this second test is truly about, not proving your loyalty, but demonstrating your self-mastery. When you show up consistently, you communicate that your peace isn't negotiable and your worth isn't on trial. You become someone who doesn't just say, I'm secure, you live it, and the moment they sense that, everything changes. Their guard lowers. Their curiosity grows. They begin to believe that maybe, this time, closeness won't cost them their freedom. Because to an avoidant, love that's unpredictable feels unsafe. But love that's consistent feels like home. And that's the kind of love that always invites them back, not through effort, but through energy. The third test is the autonomy test, the one most people fail, not because they don't care enough, but because they care in a way that feels unsafe to the avoidant. See, when an avoidant begins to come back into your orbit, they're constantly asking one unspoken question: will you let me have space without punishing me for it? For them, independence isn't just a preference. It's emotional oxygen. Space is how they regulate their sense of self. And every time they've felt smothered, controlled, or guilted in love, that oxygen supply has been cut off. So before they risk re-engaging fully, they need to know that being close to you won't mean losing their freedom again. This is where it gets complicated, because when someone you care about pulls away, your instincts tell you to close the gap. You want to reconnect, to talk it out, to understand what's wrong. But to an avoidant, that pursuit, even when it's gentle, feels like pressure. It's not about your words, it's about your energy. If you start to chase, if you demand explanations or reassurance, their nervous system reads it as danger. That's when they shut down or disappear again. They're not rejecting you. They're protecting their autonomy. And the moment you make their need for space about your need for closeness, You unintentionally confirm the fear they've been running from all along, that love will cost them their sense of self. So they test it. They'll step back after a period of connection. They'll withdraw without much reason, or they'll cancel plans and observe what happens next. Are you going to spiral? Will you send a flood of messages? Will you try to talk them out of their distance? Or can you stay composed and let them breathe without interpreting their space as rejection? That moment is the test, the space between stimulus and response, where your emotional maturity is either proven or undone. Because the truth is, it's not their withdrawal that triggers you, it's your fear of abandonment that gets activated. And when you learn to soothe that fear internally instead of projecting it outward, everything changes. Autonomy in healthy relationships isn't the absence of connection. It's the protection of individuality. The avoidant isn't asking to live on an island. They're asking for the right to have an inner world that doesn't need your constant approval to exist. When you can respect that, you become emotionally safe in a way few people ever are. You stop being the person who collapses under distance and start being the person who knows that closeness and space can coexist. That balance, warmth without control, love without demand, is magnetic. It invites them back, not because they feel obligated, but because they feel free. And that's the paradox most people miss. The more you chase an avoidant, the more they run. But the moment you release the need to control the outcome, their nervous system relaxes. They start to feel drawn back to you naturally because the dynamic no longer feels like a tug of war. It feels like choice. Choice is everything to an avoidant. They need to choose closeness, not feel coerced into it. When you understand that, you stop playing emotional chess and start practicing emotional intelligence. You let silence exist without panic. You let space exist without meaning making. You learn to trust that distance doesn't automatically mean disinterest. But let's be honest. That takes self-discipline. It takes learning to sit with discomfort, to manage the internal storm that arises when you want to reach out but know it's not the right time. It's not easy, because your brain equates silence with danger. You start to imagine scenarios, to interpret their absence as rejection. But every time you override that impulse and choose calm over chaos, you're not just passing their test, you're growing. You're retraining your own attachment system. You're proving to yourself that your emotional safety doesn't depend on someone else's proximity. That's where the real power is, not in making them stay, but in knowing you'll be okay if they don't. That kind of detachment doesn't make you cold. It makes you grounded. It sends a clear message: I'm not here to control you. I'm here to connect with you. And that's only real if it's mutual. That's the kind of energy that earns respect from an avoidant. It tells them, you're free to come and go, but I'm not collapsing either way. That steadiness doesn't push them away, it pulls them in. Because now, for the first time, they can breathe. And here's what's fascinating. Once an avoidant feels that freedom, they begin to rewire their own associations with closeness. They start to experience intimacy as something that enhances their independence rather than threatens it. That's when genuine reconnection becomes possible, not out of guilt or nostalgia, but out of peace. They realize you're not another source of pressure. You're a sanctuary where they can exist fully as themselves. So the next time they take space, don't rush to fill the silence, but don't interpret it as a sign of disinterest or punishment. See it for what it really is, a test of your ability to stay emotionally sovereign. Because every time you hold your ground with grace, you're teaching both of you something profound. that love doesn't have to mean control, and space doesn't have to mean loss. And when you can embody that truth, calm, grounded, patient, you stop trying to earn closeness and start attracting it effortlessly. Because the deepest kind of love isn't the one that clings out of fear. It's the one that holds steady out of freedom. That's the kind of love that doesn't just bring them back. It keeps both of you whole. When an avoidant ex begins to re-enter your life, you'll notice a subtle shift. They start to test the emotional waters, not by asking direct questions, but by revealing small, almost insignificant fragments of vulnerability. A story about their stress at work. A mention of something that's been weighing on them. Maybe even a quiet confession about how the breakup affected them. It's never dramatic. It's never framed as a plea for comfort. It's cautious, like someone dipping their hand into water to see if it's warm enough to step in. And that's the fourth test. Can you handle their vulnerability without trying to control it? For avoidance, vulnerability is the most dangerous terrain of all. It's where they've learned the most painful lessons. At some point, opening up was met with misunderstanding, rejection, or intrusion. So they built walls, not because they don't feel deeply, but because they feel too deeply and don't trust that anyone will handle that tenderness with care. When they start to come back, they don't need grand gestures of love. They need quiet proof that they can be emotionally open without it turning into a loss of autonomy or safety. And this is where most people fail the test, not because they're unkind, but because they misunderstand what vulnerability actually needs. When someone we care about shares something raw, our instinct is to fix it. We offer advice. We interpret their emotions. We reassure them, sometimes excessively, but to an avoidant, that rush to comfort feels like a form of control. It says, I can't stand your discomfort, so I'm going to manage it for you. What they need instead is the opposite, a sense that their inner world can exist without being corrected or contained. That means listening, not analyzing, holding, not fixing. It means being comfortable enough with silence to let their words hang in the air without scrambling to make it all better. You'd be surprised how rare that kind of listening is. Most people listen to respond. Very few listen to witness. But for an avoidant, that kind of witnessing, where you just stay present, grounded, and open, is revolutionary. It tells them you can be messy and still be accepted. You can have feelings without someone taking control of them. And in that space, trust begins to grow. There's something deeply psychological happening underneath this moment. When you respond with calm empathy instead of urgency, you're sending a message to their nervous system: vulnerability is safe here. You're showing them that closeness doesn't have to mean losing control. And that creates a new association in their mind, one where intimacy and freedom can coexist. That shift is everything because it challenges the story they've lived with for years, that love equals intrusion, that honesty leads to pressure, that openness invites pain. But here's the part that requires real emotional discipline. You have to resist the temptation to read too much into their moments of openness. When an avoidant lets their guard down, it's not an invitation to rush the process. It's not proof that they're ready to rebuild the relationship right now. It's a micro step, a small bid for emotional safety. If you respond by overanalyzing, pushing for more, or treating it as a breakthrough moment, they'll sense your urgency and retreat again. Vulnerability, for them, has to unfold slowly in small, consistent doses. It's something you earn, not something you demand. So when they open up, your role isn't to fix or to prove, it's to stay steady. Maintain eye contact. Listen fully. Offer empathy without intensity. Maybe say, "That sounds hard," or "I can understand why that would feel heavy." Simple, grounded responses. Because for the avoidant, safety isn't in the words. It's in your energy. They're reading your tone, your pacing, your emotional containment. They're noticing whether you can sit in discomfort without turning it into drama. If you can, that's when they start to relax. That's when they realize you're different. You're not trying to own their feelings. You're simply allowing them to exist. And something remarkable happens when you learn to do this. You stop fearing silence and start trusting presence. You realize that connection doesn't always come from speaking more, but from listening better. You start to embody emotional maturity, the ability to let another person have their process without needing to direct it. That's what intimacy actually is, the space between two people that allows both to remain whole. The avoidant doesn't need you to fix their fear. They need you to stop confirming it. The paradox here is that when you stop trying to control how they open up more. Because now it's safe. Now vulnerability doesn't feel like exposure. It feels like being seen. That's when they start to talk a little more freely, share a little more honestly, and trust that closeness can exist without threat. And that's the kind of connection that lasts. Not one built on urgency, but one built on presence. So, the next time they share something, a thought, a fear, a memory, slow down. Breathe before you respond. Let them feel your stillness. Let them feel that their emotions don't destabilize you. That calmness, that quiet strength, is the real proof of emotional safety. It tells them they're not walking into a storm. They're walking into calm water. Because in the end, vulnerability isn't a request for answers. It's a test of safety. And when you can meet it with stillness instead of control, empathy instead of urgency, you stop trying to pull them into connection, and you start becoming the place they naturally return to. The truth is simple. The moment you stop trying to manage their feelings, you start earning their trust. When an avoidant ex starts to circle back into your life, they're not coming back to relive the past, they're coming back to re-evaluate it. They're trying to see if the dynamic that once made them withdraw has changed, or if it's still the same emotional landscape they had to escape from. And this is where the fifth test shows up, the growth test. It's not a test of your love, your loyalty, or even your patience. It's a test of who you've become since things fell apart. They want to know, are you still the person I left, or have you evolved? See, avoidants aren't attracted to chaos. They're drawn to peace, but only peace that feels earned. After a breakup, they need distance to reset, to make sense of their emotions. When they finally reappear, they're not looking for the version of you that begged for answers or clung to the connection. They're looking for evidence of growth, emotional stability, grounded self-awareness, and a sense of independence that isn't performative. It's not about pretending you've changed. It's about actually having done the work to change. That's why they pay close attention to your energy more than your words. They notice if you still carry that anxious edge, that subtle undertone of resentment or need. They sense whether your self-worth still rises and falls with their attention. You can tell them you've grown all you want, but if your tone, your body language, your pace, if all of that still reflects emotional volatility, they'll pick up on it instantly. Avoidants are hypersensitive to emotional intensity. They read the room through nervous systems, not conversations. So when they come back, they're watching how you handle moments of uncertainty. Do you still need constant reassurance, or can you hold your center? Do you react to distance, or do you respect it? Do you still make them the center of your emotional universe, or have you built one of your own? These subtle cues tell them more than any declaration ever could. And this is where most people stumble. They mistake the avoidance return as a call to prove themselves, when in reality, it's an opportunity to embody their growth instead of explaining it. And this is where emotional evolution becomes magnetic. Growth isn't about becoming detached or indifferent. That's just another form of avoidance. Real growth is the ability to love without losing yourself. It's knowing you can care deeply without collapsing into dependence. It's the quiet confidence that says, I can meet you with love, but I can also let you go in peace if I have to. That level of inner security is what the avoidant is subconsciously searching for. They're testing whether the relationship could exist now without the emotional patterns that once suffocated it. Think of it like this: when you've grown, you no longer need them to validate your worth. You validate yourself. You no longer chase their attention to feel safe. You create your own safety. That self-assured energy doesn't just attract them back, it changes how they experience connection with you. It tells them this time might be different, because you're no longer responding from fear, you're responding from self-trust. But that kind of growth doesn't come from waiting. It comes from rebuilding your internal world. It's the hard work of self-reflection, asking yourself, what role did I play in the old dynamic? How did my fears contribute to the emotional disconnection? It's taking ownership without shame, because growth isn't about blaming yourself or the other person, it's about awareness. When you become aware of your own patterns, your triggers, your needs, your blind spots, you stop repeating them. You stop treating love like something that has to be controlled or earned. And here's what's interesting. When you start to evolve in this way, you change what kind of energy you're available for. You stop being attracted to emotional highs and lows. You stop needing to fix people to feel needed. You start valuing calm, clarity, and consistency, the very things that make an avoidant feel safe. So by growing, you don't just heal yourself, you make the connection more possible, more stable, and more sustainable than it ever was before. So when they come back, and they will in some way, your job isn't to convince them that things could be different. Your job is to be different, to move from proving your worth to embodying it, to respond from your higher self, not your wounded one. When they pull back, you don't chase, you observe. When they test your boundaries, you hold them with grace. When they open up, you don't rush in to rescue them. You stay steady and compassionate. Every time you do that, you show them and yourself that you're no longer trapped in the old story. And that's the thing about growth. It doesn't beg for recognition. It doesn't announce itself. It simply changes the atmosphere. People can feel it. The avoidant feels it. They sense that your energy no longer carries the same volatility, the same urgency. And that shift, that quiet transformation, is what makes them believe that maybe this time love could feel safe. Because here's the truth. People don't come back to the past. They come back to possibility. They return when they can sense that something has evolved, that something in you is different, calmer, deeper, wiser. So don't focus on proving that you've changed. Focus on becoming someone who doesn't need to. Because growth, real growth, isn't about getting them back. It's about getting yourself back. And once you've done that, you'll never have to chase connection again. You'll attract it naturally by the strength of who you've become. When an avoidant ex begins to reconnect, they're not just testing your patience, your consistency, or your emotional depth. They're also testing the power balance. They want to know, often unconsciously, whether the dynamic between you will return to what it once was, one person overextending and the other retreating. This final test isn't about control for its own sake. It's about respect. The avoidant needs to feel that they can engage with you as an equal, not as someone they have to manage, rescue, or distance themselves from to stay grounded. They're watching to see if you've learned the art of self-respect, because to them, love without boundaries isn't intimacy. It's instability. The power balance test often shows up in small, subtle ways. They might take longer to reply, change plans last minute, or bring up topics that once made you feel insecure, not to manipulate, but to observe how you'll handle it this time. They're looking for signals. Will you shrink to keep the peace or stand tall and stay kind? Will you bend your boundaries to accommodate them, or will you hold them with calm strength? Because every time you choose self-respect over self-sacrifice, you teach them something new about how love can look. You show them that connection doesn't require losing your dignity. This is a hard shift for most people, especially those who have been in anxious or one-sided relationships. It's easy to confuse love with self-abandonment. You think being understanding means tolerating emotional inconsistency. You think being compassionate means letting them set the pace entirely. But that's not compassion. That's fear disguised as kindness. It's the fear that if you assert yourself, you'll lose them. Ironically, that fear is the very thing that keeps them at arm's length. Avoidants are drawn to strength, not arrogance, but emotional solidity. They don't respect people who give to be loved. They respect people who know their worth and communicate it quietly through action. When you've done your own emotional work, when you've healed enough to stop chasing and start choosing, your energy changes. You no longer need to prove your value, and that neutrality is incredibly powerful. You become someone who can love fully and set limits. You can say, I'm here, but I also have boundaries. And that energy doesn't repel avoidance. It attracts them. Because deep down, they don't want to dominate. They want to feel safe enough to meet you as an equal. But equality only exists when both people honor themselves. So how does this play out in real life? Let's say they resurface, texting inconsistently, offering vague plans, or keeping the connection on their terms. Instead of reacting from fear, you stay grounded. You don't chase and you don't punish. You match effort with effort. You keep your energy balanced. You express interest, but you don't overextend. You give, but you don't overgive. That middle ground is where the dynamic shifts. Because now, instead of being the one who's always emotionally available, you become the one who's emotionally discerning. You teach them, through your behavior, that access to you is earned through consistency and respect. It's not about playing games. It's about maintaining balance. Games are rooted in manipulation. Boundaries are rooted in clarity. And clarity is what allows love to grow without fear. When you communicate your needs calmly, when you hold your standards without making them a threat, you create a relationship dynamic where both people can stand tall. That's where attraction deepens, not in chaos or unpredictability, but in the quiet recognition that both people are bringing their full selves to the table. Avoidants test power because they fear losing control in love. But what they're really longing for is someone who can handle power responsibly, who won't exploit their vulnerability, and who won't surrender their own in the process. They're looking for equilibrium, not dominance. So when they sense that you can love them without collapsing, that you can give without losing yourself, they begin to trust that this connection could be safe, Not because it's perfect, but because it's balanced. And let's be clear, balance doesn't mean passivity. It's not about staying quiet or being endlessly patient. It's about owning your energy. It's about being willing to walk away if the connection costs your peace. It's about being open, but not exposed. Loving, but not desperate. That's the kind of strength that an avoidant respects. That's the kind of self-possession that commands attention without demanding it. When you embody that, you shift from seeking validation to creating value. You're no longer waiting for their behavior to dictate your emotional state. You've taken your power back. You're no longer trapped in the cycle of chase and retreat. You've stepped into the steady rhythm of mutual respect. And once that balance is established, everything changes. Conversations become easier. Boundaries become natural. Connection stops feeling like a negotiation and starts feeling like a choice. Because love, at its healthiest, is never about who holds the power. It's about two people who no longer need to. It's about two individuals strong enough to choose each other freely, without fear, without control, without losing themselves in the process. That's the kind of connection that doesn't just rekindle, it sustains. So when you find yourself in that moment, when your avoidant ex starts to reappear and the old pattern threatens to repeat, remember this: every interaction is an opportunity to show who you've become. Don't prove your worth. Levitt, don't chase equality. Embody it. Because the moment you stop fighting for balance and start being the balance, you've already passed the test. And that's when love stops being a battlefield and becomes a meeting point between two whole people who finally see each other clearly.